Welcome, Trailblazers. If you're reading this, you're not just here by chance. You're here because something inside you refuses to stay silent any longer. You've felt it, haven't you? That stirring in your gut, that ache in your chest, that quiet knowing that your voice was never meant to be muted. It was meant to move mountains. This space, it's for the ones who were told to shrink, but chose to rise. For the ones who were trained to obey, but dared to question. For the ones who carry stories so powerful, the moment they're spoken, they shift atmospheres. You are not ordinary. And your words, when you finally let them out, aren't just expressions. They're lightning. They're keys. They're catalysts. So let this be your reminder. You don't need permission to speak your truth. You don't need validation to own your story. You are the evidence that silence can't hold forever. And the world may not have been ready for your voice, but that's exactly why it needs to hear it. This isn't about ego. It's about purpose. It's about reclaiming what was stolen and refusing to play small ever again. So take a deep breath. Sit up a little taller. And know this, you are not alone. You're part of a rising. Let's dive in. Because once a voice like yours starts speaking, nothing stays the same. Looking for purpose and peace? Hit subscribe and start the journey. They called it speaking, but it was more like shattering a long-standing illusion. What emerged wasn't a complaint or a confession. It was a collision with a history that had been carefully muted. This wasn't an echo of the present, but a rupture of a legacy that had long been locked beneath layers of denial. A wound deeper than one life, older than memory, had finally been named. It wasn't merely a recounting of events. It was a reckoning that shook the architecture of quiet complicity. The room didn't fall silent because of discomfort. It fell silent because something ancient had been disturbed. And suddenly, those around you weren't just hearing words. They were facing a truth too big to ignore. The unspoken contracts of suppression were being torn apart in real time. Some structures depend on stillness to survive, on everyone agreeing not to notice what hurts. But in that moment, the unacknowledged was acknowledged, and the fragile scaffolding that had upheld false harmony began to collapse. The things that had always been hidden no longer belonged to the shadows. And when hidden things meet exposure, they change. Sometimes they vanish. Sometimes they fight back. The tremor that followed wasn't just emotional, it was elemental. It shifted more than opinions. It cracked something rooted in silence. Ironically, you might have believed you were doing something small, but that spark became a signal, and suddenly others felt something stir in their own locked drawers of memory. That one disruption became a portal, not just a shield. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. Retaliation came swiftly, not because what you said was false, but because its truth was too luminous. When a carefully staged calm is exposed as theater, those invested in the act grow frantic. Their control depended on your silence, and when that vanished, so did their illusion of order. You didn't just reclaim your space, you redrew the map. And some are still reeling from the fact that it was never theirs to begin with. That sound wasn't just a release. It was a key turning in a lock that had rusted shut through generations of disbelief. What was once dismissed as noise turned out to be the very proof the cosmos had been holding space for. It wasn't an outburst. It was an activation. Somewhere far beyond the grasp of ordinary perception, your voice became a mark of record, solid, stamped, irreversible. At first glance, it may have looked like a moment of expression, a clearing of weight too long carried. But unseen mechanisms stirred as your truth took shape. What had once been shapeless ache finally gained definition, and once named, it could no longer be ignored by the deeper systems that balance unseen scales. In silence, injustice often floats, unanchored, deniable. But the instant you spoke, it settled into form, undeniable and exact. And that's when movement began, not loud, but sure. A recalibration began in dimensions we don't map, the kind that answers not to power, but to integrity. You weren't just declaring something. You were initiating change, and it traveled farther than sound can. The unease others felt wasn't confusion, it was recognition. Something within them caught the echo, even if they couldn't admit it. Because unfiltered truth doesn't beg for attention. It enters a space and immediately starts rearranging it. It presses against denial. It sharpens the air. It whispers what can no longer be covered. With one act of expression, You set off a sequence. Not visible, not dramatic, but undeniably real. As if a signal had been received, and now forces that wait for honesty could finally respond. You didn't just shift your own space. You summoned reinforcements. You awakened the watching to step in that, if your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. There are events that rewrite everything, even if no one realizes it in the moment. That was one. No fanfare, no spotlight, but somewhere in the architecture of unseen justice, doors slid open, because truth always draws attention, especially when it's not supposed to be spoken. And in that stillness, after your voice dropped, something ancient nodded and began to move. What crumbled wasn't caused by volume, but precision. The entire illusion had been balanced on the assumption that no one would speak clearly enough to unravel it. But the moment those truths emerged, clarity sliced through deception like glass through fog. Not because it was loud, but because it was accurate. The fallout wasn't about blame. It was about exposure. And exposure does not ask for permission. It simply arrives. The carefully arranged lies had grown confident in their camouflage, but your words stripped away the comfort of darkness. And what hid beneath wasn't just uncomfortable, it was undeniable. Their surprise wasn't about innocence. It was about timing. They never planned for the reckoning to come from someone who remembered with such sharpness. The stories they clung to began to crack, not because of drama, but because reality stood beside them and measured their weight, and found them wanting. No accusations were needed. The truth did its own work. It moved like a pulse through the space, causing masks to shift and roles to fray. You didn't come to ruin anything. You came to breathe. But the very act of breathing in truth sent fault lines through what they thought was permanent. What followed was not chaos, but consequence. Unspoken tensions lit up like warning signals. Connections once held together by manipulation began to unravel, not from attack, but from revealed alignment. The curtain fell, and when it did, no one could look at the actors the same way. The unraveling didn't happen because you aimed to destroy. It happened because you carried what couldn't be silenced anymore. And in releasing it, you triggered something larger than intention, a chain reaction that couldn't be contained. Not because you were trying to win, but because they were never built on truth to begin with. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. They're those who challenge entire systems without warning, without invitation. And that's what changes everything. There was no schedule, no nod of approval, no granted space. The design had you boxed in, labeled, and expected to remain quiet, folded neatly into their arrangement of appearances. Your compliance was part of their script, and you were never supposed to rewrite the lines. But the moment came, and you rewrote it anyway. You disregarded the roles handed to you, the artificial courtesy, the pressure to behave. You answered to none of it, and that refusal wasn't just resistance. It was a fracture in the foundation. The expectation was submission. What they got instead was a rupture. There had been an order, one where only pre-approved voices got airtime, where the message was curated and filtered for comfort. You violated none of that. You simply ignored it. And in doing so, you stripped the performance down to its bones. You didn't dress it up. You didn't soften the edges. You let the truth come through, stark and unapologetic. The reaction wasn't confusion. It was fear. Not because you exaggerated, but because you didn't. You broke the silence cleanly, like snapping a chain that had gone unnoticed. And that kind of unfiltered honesty, the kind born from endurance rather than strategy, carries a force no performance can imitate. They lost their grip on the narrative, and they knew it. For so long they had controlled the volume, edited the angles, filtered the facts. But you stepped outside of their perimeter and told it like it was, on your terms. You didn't follow their rhythm. You introduced your own, and it shook the framework. You weren't seeking revenge. You were claiming space. And in that act, others found their own silence beginning to shift. The patterns began to dissolve. People started asking questions they never would have dared. You cracked something open that won't reseal. There was no knock, no introduction. You didn't enter politely. You broke through, and by the time they turned around, it was too late. They were looking at the very person they'd counted on to remain invisible. The shift had already begun. That if your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. Some learned to thrive off your silence. They mistook it for absence and filled that void with their own designs. The quieter you stayed, the bolder they became, scribbling versions of you they could weaponize, narrating stories they assumed would go uncontested. That quietness was twisted into evidence against you. They claimed it as weakness, branded it as confusion, used it to prove points they never earned. It wasn't your voice they feared. It was your stillness and what it might be gathering. They didn't think silence could listen, or wait, or remember. They gambled on your restraint. But when the moment came, you didn't stutter. You didn't ease into it. You were clear, intentional, every word measured like a pulse. And what they hadn't counted on was that your silence had been loading. Quietly, consistently, completely. You didn't return with chaos. You returned with precision. You dismantled the fiction line by line, with no need for spectacle. The damage they tried to hide now lay scattered at their feet, and they couldn't stop the bleeding. The authority they imagined they had was undone not with a storm, but with your clarity. You took the very thing they had used against you, reshaped it, and handed it back too sharp to hold. The truths they buried surfaced fully formed, undeniable, and aimed. They thought they controlled the frame. They thought they'd won because you hadn't spoken. But now the air is different. Their grip has loosened. The structure they built no longer stands untouched. Because your silence didn't disappear, it transformed. And when it finally moved, it split through the illusion like heat through frost. Some voices become guides without asking for the title. That's how change often begins. Not with a plan, not with a podium, but with someone telling the truth because they can't carry it in silence anymore. There was no speech prepared, no strategy in place, just the urgent need to name what had gone unnamed for too long. But those words, born from necessity, turned into something larger. They became points of orientation for those who had been wandering through confusion. People didn't just understand, they felt recognized. Not inspired, but awakened. In your truth, they found the outlines of their own. You didn't set out to educate. You weren't trying to gather followers, but your honesty gave others the language to unlock things they'd buried under shame or doubt. Complex wounds that wore no scars began to make sense. You described what they hadn't yet dared to acknowledge. You gave a shape to shadows, and that changed everything. Because once people can name the pattern, they can step out of it. Once they see themselves in your story, they begin to question their own silence. That's the impact you didn't plan for. While you were simply trying to survive, others were learning to breathe. You never knew how many had been isolating with invisible pain, thinking they were alone. But your words cleared the fog, not by preaching, but by revealing. And somehow, in doing so, you paved a path they didn't know they were allowed to walk. There was no perfection in your delivery, just rawness, and that made it more powerful. People didn't hear an expert. They heard someone who made it through. You weren't offering answers. You were proving survival is possible while still in motion. The moment passed, but its echo stayed. People are finding footing on stones you unknowingly laid. They're discovering freedom using a language you helped unearth. And even now, as they begin their own unraveling, they trace it back to the moment they realized they weren't crazy. They were just silent, like you once were. Control built on image can only hold for so long before truth causes it to fracture. They never imagined their grip would be undone by a single unguarded statement. But when the truth surfaced, it didn't just shake them. It unspooled the performance they built everything around. It wasn't the content that undid them. It was the clarity. Because they hadn't prepared for exposure. They'd prepared for obedience. And when the script didn't go as rehearsed, their reaction told a deeper story than anything you said. They didn't refute with calm. They erupted. They contorted reality, summoned distractions, flung accusations, and painted themselves as the victim. But the intensity of their backlash didn't hide the truth. It confirmed it. That chaos wasn't strength. It was collapse. What people once mistook for confidence started looking like calculation. The curtain they hid behind started slipping, not because you tore it down, but because their reaction couldn't keep it up. Their breakdown did the revealing for you. Their panic became the headline. You weren't out to ruin anyone. You weren't even fighting. But your truth brushed against the thread that held their image together, and it all came undone. What followed wasn't conflict, it was exposure. The kind no one could unsee. Their stories relied on silence like scaffolding. But once that was gone, they lost the illusion of composure. They couldn't contain the fallout, because your words didn't just contradict them. They stripped away the need to believe their version at all. What they had masked as dignity unraveled into spectacle. They showed everyone what they really needed to stay balanced. Your silence. And when they couldn't have it, they spiraled. You never aimed to dismantle anything. You just spoke. But in speaking, you proved how much of their reality depended on your restraint. And now, without it, they're left performing in a play no one's watching anymore. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. Some people shift legacies without knowing they're doing it. Not by force, not through rebellion, but simply by refusing to repeat what never made sense to begin with. The cycle was never built to stop with you. It was supposed to keep moving, invisible and undisturbed, coded into gestures, silences, and loyalties disguised as love. That repetition had been humming beneath the surface for lifetimes. It disguised itself as culture, as family, as how things are. But then came the interruption. One sentence, one truth, one refusal to carry the weight any further. And suddenly, the repetition hit a wall it couldn't pass through. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't planned. But it was irreversible. Where others swallowed pain, you named it. Where secrecy had been tradition, you asked questions out loud. And that was enough to freeze the cycle mid-step. Everything after that moment became heavier. Not because you were weak, but because you were doing work that spanned timelines. Every truth you uncovered loosened threads stitched tight for generations. You weren't just tending to your own wounds. You were unweaving inherited denial. This is why healing has felt like a battle, because it is. A battle not just for your peace, but for a new story that doesn't begin in damage. You became the inflection point, the place where the repetition stumbled. And now the echoes sound different, because you altered the rhythm. You were never meant to question it. That's why the backlash came like a storm. The pressure to stay silent wasn't random, it was strategic. But you didn't fall back into silence. You didn't normalize cruelty because it came from familiar faces. You didn't label harm as tradition. You stepped outside the script. And the discomfort around you now. That's the system glitching. That's the pattern trying to reboot and failing. Because the silence that used to shield dysfunction is now carrying your truth like a warning bell. And people are hearing it, even the ones pretending not to. This shift is generational. Those watching you now won't inherit the same version of the story. The narrative has cracked, and you did that not by surviving quietly, but by living out loud in the face of everything that told you not to. There are battles that don't begin with fists. They begin with silence. That's where they hoped you'd stay. Locked away in doubt, confusion, and isolation so deep it rewrote your own memory. The tactics were subtle at first, distorted reflections, reworked conversations, loyalty used like a leash. They wanted exhaustion to make you vanish, not physically, but spiritually. They counted on your voice rusting from disuse, your certainty eroding until nothing left inside felt firm enough to speak. But that silence didn't empty you. It condensed something far more powerful than they understood. And when it finally broke, it didn't sound like fear. It sounded like fire. What you spoke wasn't just personal, it was seismic. It tore through carefully staged illusions and rendered every covert tactic useless. They prepared for you to disappear, not for you to declare. The truth didn't beg. It didn't warn. It arrived. And in its wake, every mask they'd worn began to slip. Not because you demanded it, but because truth destabilizes whatever depends on a lie to stand. You didn't need to argue. Their response exposed more than your words ever could. What had been whispered in corners now roared through the air. They scrambled, not to restore peace, but to rebuild their illusion. They weren't trying to defend reality. They were trying to keep their control from collapsing in public. Their undoing wasn't your fault. It was built into their foundation. The panic wasn't about what you said. It was about losing the silence they thought they owned. You weren't supposed to speak. That's what scared them. Not because you lied, but because you told it clean. They underestimated the impact of one voice surrounded by truth. They expected to bury you in distortion. Instead, they ended up facing themselves in the mirror of your courage. And now that you've spoken, nothing in their version feels stable, because your truth didn't ask to be accepted. It just arrived, and now it's not leaving. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. Some truths don't scream, they reflect. The moment honesty passed through your voice, it stopped being just words. It became something unavoidable, not because it was loud, but because it revealed what others had spent years dodging. It wasn't your emotion that shook them. It was your precision. You didn't attack. You didn't perform. You simply described. But description is dangerous when it puts a spotlight on everything someone's tried to keep in the dark. You offered no accusations. You gave no commentary. Yet somehow, their defenses collapsed the second your truth met the air. That collapse wasn't caused by volume. It was caused by recognition. They weren't just hearing your experience. They were facing their own reflections, versions of themselves they weren't ready to confront. Their carefully rehearsed identities fell apart at the edges because your clarity erased their ability to pretend. That's why their reaction was so sharp. Not because you distorted the facts, but because you didn't. You didn't create damage, you revealed it. You didn't break them. They were already broken. You just stopped participating in the illusion that kept them appearing whole. No embellishment was needed. Your story, unedited, was enough to unravel theirs. The more calmly you spoke, the more violently they reacted. Because there's nothing more disarming than a truth that doesn't ask to be believed. It just exists. Now, they struggle not with your voice, but with their own conscience. They can't look at you without feeling the aftermath of that reflection. Their discomfort is a side effect of clarity they didn't want but now can't escape. You didn't destroy their image. You simply let it be seen. And that was more than enough. When everyone else buried their truth in silence, you let yours breathe in public. The things most feared to utter, you articulated with clarity. Not because you wanted to shock, but because you couldn't carry it alone anymore. You weren't trying to be bold. You were trying to breathe. But in doing so, you disrupted a silence that had protected false peace. The truths you spoke weren't new. Others had lived them, too, quietly, painfully. They whispered it to themselves behind closed doors, too scared to say it out loud. Until you did. You didn't just challenge a lie. You interrupted a pattern. What others only dared to think, you gave voice to. And in that voice, the unspoken ache of many found language. Not polished or poetic, but real enough to be undeniable. You exposed something they had all felt, but no one had framed. That's why the impact cut deeper than expected. You didn't just say what happened. You named what had been normalized. You described what others were told to ignore. And in that moment, silence fractured. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. What followed wasn't just echo, it was movement. The words you released traveled, awakening something in those who had stayed small to stay safe. Some found relief. Others felt threatened, because your honesty disturbed the hierarchy of silence. Your strength made people feel again. And for some, that was freedom. For others, it was confrontation. Not with you, but with themselves. You didn't try to make anyone uncomfortable. But truth has a way of making comfort a casualty. That's why some now stand beside you while others step away. You didn't push them. They're reacting to the space you created, space where truth can exist without shame. You weren't just the first to speak. You were the first to refuse silence. And that refusal lit a path others didn't know they needed. What you said wasn't just heard. It's still reverberating. Through rooms, through hearts, through generations. And what they thought was just a moment of defiance, it became a turning point they can't forget.